Welcome to the July 14th meeting of the North American Numbering Council, or the NANCY. This is Marilyn Jones, the designated federal officer for the NANCY, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for your attendance and your support. Today, we will be considering and voting on recommendations from the NANCY's North Numbering Administration Oversight Working Group and its toll-free assignment modernization working group. With that summary of the agenda, I would turn it over to Jennifer McKee, the NANCY chair.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, hi. Thank you for joining us for our second virtual NANCY meeting today. We also welcome viewers who are watching the meeting via the live stream. To our council working group members, we appreciate your continued flexibility and hope that everyone is well and adjusting to the new circumstances. So, as with the last virtual meeting we had, I will start by going over a few technical guidelines. First of all, please keep your phone on mute when you are not speaking. If you need to take another call or leave the meeting momentarily, please don't put the call on hold, for some systems have hold music that will play and then we'll all hear that. Instead, either leave on mute if you can, or leave the call and simply join back in. For those of us on WebEx, we ask that you disable the video functions. You should see a button on your screen with a camera on it. Circles, the circles down at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure the function is off, and this will help the meeting run smoothly. If you have any questions or comments during our designated discussion times after the presentations, there are 3 ways that you can let us know. First, you can raise your hand electronically. There's a circular icon, those same circular icons where the phone was. Select participants, and then along the side, you should see a list of names, including your own, and there'll be a raise hand icon next to your name. You just click it and it will let us know that you want to speak. Marilyn will be able to see who raises a hand, and at the end of a segment, we can address your questions. Once we call on you, you can unmute your phone to ask your question, and then when you are finished, unclick the icon to turn off the raise hand function so that we know you no longer have a question or comment. The host cannot control that raise hand function. You need to do that yourself, so please be sure to unclick it once you are done with your comment. If you are having difficulty with that method, you can also ask a question by using the chat feature. You can send a message to Marilyn as the host, and then she will read it. She's the only one who can see those. They are not public, so she will read it aloud for the group in the record. And then finally, if you want to respond to a question that has been asked, you can simply unmute your phone. If you go with this option, please identify yourself when you speak. We might not be able to recognize your voice. And then please also remember to put your phone back on mute when you are done speaking. Now, as we go through the agenda and any questions arise, Marilyn or I will verbally pass the mic to those of you who are presenting. Again, we are trying to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to be heard, and we're trying to do it in as orderly a fashion as possible. We will be voting on recommendations during this meeting. To conduct the vote, I will call for volunteers to make motions, and Marilyn will ask each member for their vote. Please remember to unmute your phones to make a motion and respond to Marilyn with your vote, and then put yourself back on mute. Does anyone have any questions on technical aspects of the meeting before we move forward? Okay. As a reminder, members of the public with questions for the NANCY were asked to submit comments via the Commission's electronic comment filing system. Members of the public watching the live stream can also ask a question by sending it via email to livequestions@fcc.gov. That's live, L-I-V-E, questions, Q-U-E-S-T-I-O-N-S, all one word, at fcc.gov. Submitted questions will be read live during the public participation portion of the meeting. Now, before we begin the meeting, do any members need to make any disclosures? Okay. Then I will ask if my Vice Chair, Bruce Williamson, has any comments or remarks that you would like to make before we get started, Bruce?
Second, turn off mute. No, I have no comments to make.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. Then I'll turn the meeting back over to the designated federal official, Marilyn Jones, and she will conduct our roll call.
Thanks, Chair Key. Let's start with 800 response. Is anyone here from 800 response? ACA Connects. Ad hoc Telecommunications Users Committee.
Susan Gately here for Ad hoc.
Thank you, Susan. ADIS, Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions.
Good afternoon. This is Jackie Walgermuth with Addis.
Good afternoon, Jackie. AT&T.
Olayo Fusi here for agency.
Thank you. Bandwidth.
Greg Rogers is on for Bandwidth.
Thank you. Charter Communications.
Betty Sench is on, Maryland.
Thank you, Betty. Comcast Corporation.
Tim Cagle is on for Comcast, Maryland.
Thank you, Tim. CCA.
Good afternoon. It's Alexi Malthus for CCA.
Thank you, Alexi. CTIA. Google.
Hi, Marilyn. This is Craig Lennon.
Hi, Craig. Encompass. NARUC. Nasuka.
Good afternoon. This is Barry Hobbins, Public Advocate of Maine, representing Nasuka.
Thank you, Barry. NTCA.
Hey, Marilyn. Brian Ford is here.
Hi, Brian. Nevada Public Utilities Commission.
Hi, this is Lee Williamson.
Hi, Commissioner. Peerless Network.
Hi, this is Julie Oates with Peerless.
Hi, Julie. SIP Forum. Sprint Corporation.
Hi, Marilyn. Shauna Forshey here.
Thank you. Thank you, Shauna. TDS.
Hello, Marilyn. Paul Najudlo is here.
Hi, Paul. Telnet.
Good afternoon, Marilyn. David Casem here.
Good afternoon, David. Twilio. US Connect.
Good afternoon, Marilyn. Bridget Alexander White is on for US Connect.
Thank you, Bridget. US
You're
Telecom.
welcome.
US Telecom. Verizon.
Dana Crandall here. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Dana. Vonage.
Alan Vasquez here representing Vonage.
Hi, Alan. West Telecom. Entrada.
Bob McCausland is here for the old West Telecom Services, now known as Intrado Communications.
Thank you, Bob. iConnective.
Chris Drake is here for iConnective.
Welcome, Chris. Somo. Somo.
It looks like Joel Bernstein is on the.
Yeah.
It looks
I
like
thought
he's
I saw
on.
Joel.
Yeah, but I don't know if he's on mute or having trouble, but it looks like he is on the participant list on the WebEx.
Okay. Yeah, I see him on my list.
Marilyn, this is Jordan. I also see Melissa Blassingame and Karen Charles Peterson, but they didn't respond.
Hi, I just joined the audio. Melissa Blassingame from Twilio.
Okay, Melissa for Twilio and Nayrook. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, that completes the roll call. Thanks, everyone. Back to you, Chair McKee.
Thank you, Marilyn. Before we get started with our agenda today, I just want to take a minute to welcome a new designated alternate representative for the Call Authentication Trust Anchor Working Group. Robert Dianda from Charter Communications will be joining as the designated alternate. We know that the CATA Working Group is hard at work on recommendations for our consideration at the September meeting. So we appreciate Robert bringing his expertise to the table and supporting that team. Now, the first item on our agenda, we're going to hear a report from the North American Numbering Plan Billing and Collection Agent, and presenting for Welch is Heather Bambro. Heather, if you are there, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Heather Bambro calling from Welch. I'm going to present today the NEMP budget for the 2021 funding year, as well as the contribution factor that is being recommended. The first two pages, if we can go to the page that has the actual budget, I think it's probably next page. So I'm going to talk to this. The pages before that are just written detail of the numbers on here. So for numbering administration, we have budgeted again $3.4 million for NAPA administration costs based on the Somos contract that was awarded over a year ago and was extended through to the end of October. Given that there's been no award of the new contract, we're using that as the basis for our cost for NEMP administration. From that, we have deducted the amounts that are contributed by the international participants, Caribbean countries, and Canada. They will be contributing $203,000 towards the $3.4 million cost, leaving an amount of $3.198 million of NEMP costs that will be funded by the U.S. carriers. In addition to that, we have the 1K pooling. It's still being separated out, even though it was anticipated to be combined into the upcoming contract. Again, because of no known numbers, we've gone with the amounts that are as per the Somos contract in existence right now in the extension. For both the NAPA administration and the 1K block pooling, we also added 2 months worth of transition costs, anticipating that if there is a change in vendors, that there may be transition costs between Somos and a new vendor if that is the case. So we've built that into the budget, anticipating that there might be transition costs. From that, that comes up to $4.464 million. We've allowed for carrier audits. We are required to provide this amount in the budget according to FCC Order 00-42 and under the Code of Federal Regulations 52.15K. These are for carrier audits that are deemed by NAPA or the FCC to be done on carriers with regards to their compliance with funding NEMP and the revenue numbers that they submit. The next line item is the billing collection agent, which is ourselves. The amount that's been provided is as per our contract, $340,800. The data collection agent, this cost of $78,000 is the fee that we pay to USAC as our share of the cost of the data collection for the Form 499As, from which we use the information to prepare the billings to the various carriers. The annual operations audit is required under our contract. It's an independent audit of the FCC. It is done by Ernst & Young, and we provide $50,000 based on an annual increase of $1,000 per year historically. Bank charges are estimated to be about $38,000, again, based on historical figures. Bad debt expense is the accounts that we consider uncollectible of the annual billings that we send out each year. We did look at, initially this number is based on historical numbers. We also took into account the effects of COVID-19 and did some analysis on what would happen if some of the smaller carriers were unable to pay, and we don't think that that will affect a number here significantly. As I will discuss later on, we do have room in the proposed contingency allowance for some of those additional costs if they should occur. The costs are then reduced by interest income. It's the interest that we earn on the bank account throughout the year on the balances, and that's estimated at $30,000, again, based on history, and the late filing fees of the Form 499A. Basically, we assess a $100 late filing fee if the form has not been filed by April 30th of each year. And again, based on history, we estimate that to be about $80,000. That will reduce the cost. So overall, the cost for NEMP activities is going to be $8,299,571. That will be required to be funded by U.S. carriers. We then took the anticipated surplus that we anticipate to have at the end of September 2020 of $2,906,234 as per our April NAOWG report, and we're going to apply that surplus against $8.2 million. This surplus arose as a result of last year we had provided $2 million in anticipation that possibly the pooling and the NAPA administration contract is going to be awarded during this current funding period, and that was to cover any differences between the contract that was awarded and the amounts that we provide in the budget. That didn't happen during this funding period, at least not so far to date. The other $900,000 is mainly made up of two things. One, carry-outs of $200,000, which was not expended during this funding period, and the remaining was in last year's budget as well. We had allowed for 2 months transition costs, and as a result, we're not using those at this point in time. We're pushing them over into the next funding period that this budget is on. So that's what's making up the surplus from last year that we're now going to apply against the basically $8.3 million. So the total cost to be funded by U.S. carriers for any NEMP activities before the contingency allowance is $5,393,337. On top of that, based on an FCC order, we are going to be managing the collection of fees from the various carriers for the creation of the reassigned numbers database. We have been directed to collect $6 million on this particular item. We're basing it on in the budget as a high-end estimate that was provided to us by the FCC. We do need to include this number in here because of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So we do have to collect some funds before this database can be created. We have to have the funds in hand. So overall, before the contingency allowance was decided upon by the NAOWG, the amount to be collected is $11,393,337. If we go to the next slide, or next page, we provide them with 3 scenarios to decide upon with regards to the contingency factor. And I'm just going to focus on option number 3, which is what the NAOWG voted on, and are recommending a $2 million contingency, again, because of the NAPA and pooling contract not being awarded yet. So the net U.S. requirement, contribution requirement will be $13,393,337 for this funding year, which runs from October 1st, 2020 to September 30th, 2021. The resulting contingency factor will be, with regards to NAP activities, it will be 0.000699, and the contribution factor related to the creation of the reassigned numbers database is 0.000567, which then gives us a contribution factor of 0.000127. Does anybody have any questions?
I see Bob McCausland hand is up.
Hi there. This is Bob McCausland. I just want to comment about the $200,000 carrier audit amount. We had dialogued that a little bit. I needed to better understand that a little bit. And that amount was long ago quite clearly identified and recommended by the FCC to be included year after year. And the purpose is to allow for the FCC or the NANPA or the pooling administrator or state commissions to initiate for-cause audits. And I understand that no for-cause audit has taken place in many years, but nonetheless, there is a need for that. So I wanted to put on the record of this call that we had looked at that again and determined it to be appropriate. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, hearing none, I just want to thank you very much, Heather. We appreciate the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks. Now we will move on to the next item, which is an overview of the Numbering Administration Oversight Working Group report and recommendation on the billing and collection fund size projections and contributions factor. And Phil Lindsay, the co-chair of the NAOWG, will be presenting this recommendation. So Phil, I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Chair McKee. Again, my name is Philip Lindsay. I'm with CenturyLink. I co-chair the NAOWG, or the North American Numbering, or the Number Administration Oversight Working Group. I co-chair this along with Robert McCausland of Intrado Communications, as well as Betty Sanders of Charter. We also have, I've identified here our liaisons, FCC liaisons, Michelle Slater, Merv Charles, and Karen Schroeder. If we can move on to the next slide, please, or the next page. Our contract oversight activity includes the monthly review of the deliverables for the BNC agent, the NAMPA, and the PA. We also are overseeing the bridge contract extensions. We are on the second of two extensions, of which will expire in the end of October, which you'll see later on in this report. The L&P oversight establishment, and then the two items that will be up for Nancy vote, which is the 2020-2021 budget and contribution factor report that Heather just read out on, as well as the performance evaluation that the NAOWG has performed for the BNC agent. And so we'll run through those in this presentation. So if we move to the next slide, please. So our area of responsibility is oversight of the North American Numbering Plan Administrator, the Pooling Administration, Billing Collection Agent, as well as Number Portability Administration. The FCC contract oversight of the following vendors is the BNC agent and the North American Numbering Administrator, which is Somos, the BNC agent, which is Welch, and then the Pooling Administrator is also with Somos. So we can move on to the next slide. This is a slide that goes through kind of the contract status. This isn't really new. I think we've seen this in previous NANCI meetings. We're in the second of those 3-month extensions for both the NAMP and the PA. And then for the BNC agent, we're into the 5-year contract that began in May of 2018. Move on to the next slide. From a number portability perspective, we're in the midst of establishing an arrangement to where what was formerly known as the LNPA working group and the efforts that they were engaged with to establish best practices and other items important to the industry. We want to provide a conduit for a new entity that will be established, and I think it will most likely be sponsored by iConnected, which is the current MPAC administrator. So we're just in the midst of that. I think the next meeting of this informal group will establish or begin establishing the governance and structure for that group. And then there'll be a liaison that would then work into the NAOWG to bring any items into the NANCI. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. So this is the recommendation from the NAOWG for the contribution factor. This is kind of a summary of what Heather from Welch just has gone through. The budget includes the anticipated potential cost for the transition of the bridge contract, and then the contingency fund was determined based on consideration of R&D development costs, potential change orders, as well as contract uncertainty and potential base contract rate increases. The overall net carrier contribution requirement is the $13 million, which is what the overall contribution factor was calculated upon. I put some additional background information in here around what it was in the previous year at the bottom left of the slide, just to give people a perspective of how this is changing year over year. One thing I'd like to kind of point out to folks is the significant difference in what we've experienced over the last 10 years as far as the decline in the revenue base. Year over year, it's been on average around 7% or so. Between last year and this year, it increased to around 14%. So the rate of decline has almost doubled just over this last year, and that was determined prior to COVID. So just a point of reference, people think about kind of their business and if it's applicable here and how that might align with what folks understand within their own businesses. So with that, I think we can move on to the next slide. So I wanted to put in here some items that were not included in the actual contribution factor, just to provide folks with a perspective of what is to come and what will need to be considered in future contribution factors. So the cost of combining the NAMPA and PA systems, the TRD that was previously developed around 2016, 2017 was an attempt to create some efficiencies by combining systems that are currently separate systems and are under separate contracts. The contract that is proposed, it will essentially be combining those systems under the TRD that the group had previously developed. The cost of combined NAMPA PA annual operations is not really known, so that kind of increase or that kind of cost is not considered in this contribution factor. And then the cost of a vendor study to allocate the combined NAMPA contract cost among international entities. There's been a longstanding percentage that has been assumed associated with the applicable portions of the NAMPA system. And with the combination of this system, it will drive the need to redetermine the percent allocation to those international entities, the Canada and Caribbean type countries. So that's just another piece of this that, of course, has not been. We don't have that information as of yet. That's yet to be determined. So, and then the cost of the BNC agent and the R&D fund administration, the development or the management of the funds associated with funding the development of the R&D will be required by the BNC agent, which was not contemplated within the current contract. So there'll be some level of a change order that will be coming through associated with that once that's been developed as well. So the next slide. This is just some historical information for folks to take a look at. It's for more of informational purposes. Just puts things in perspective as far as and historically. And so we can then move on to the next slide. So that's in conclusion of the contribution factor proposal and recommendation by the NAOWG. This next section is the portion of the NAOWG report that will lay out the performance review that we initiated for Welch, which is our vendor for our billing and collections. So we developed the evaluation consistent with the monthly deliverable matrix, which we've developed consistent with the contract. We use a rating schematic used for performance, and it was based on a met and not met basis. We scheduled conference calls to gain industry consensus on rating and evaluation. So the next slide, please. So we considered several things when we looked at the evaluation, the monthly deliverables, the 2019 team meeting materials from our monthly calls, the SEC and Nancy reports, monthly reports, consumer service processes, cleanup of receivables, and NAOWG observations, co-chair interaction with Welch, and contribution factor and budget related communications printed material. We can move on to the next slide, please. Our evaluation for 2019 was a MET and is the recommendation of the NAOWG. This rating is defined below, which is the MET requirements in order to be considered successful. Performance was competent and reliable. Decisions, recommendations were within the requirements and expectations. And, you know, as part of our matrix, we typically review these on this level throughout the year for each meeting that each month that we meet and review through our oversight. So in our next slide, so 2019 Welch performance review, the budget estimates were made more difficult due to unknown budget estimates. Again, I identified some of the things out there in previous slides that were not considered. We also were evaluating, which is why we have kind of a higher contingency fund because of a lot of the unknown type items. So Welch was integral in us coming to the conclusion as to what our recommendation is for the contribution factor and budget. The unexpected NAMPA vendor change added additional complexities. This is basically has created the whole need to do the bridge contracts and that kind of thing. So although this occurred several years ago, we're still addressing and dealing with the ramifications of that change. And so that is also one of the complexities of that Welch has had to deal with. So Welch initiated and completed a change of banking vendor with advantageous terms that allowed cost savings and enhanced services, such as the use of credit cards for service provider payments. This has been kind of a long-standing issue and kind of a difficulty with some providers needing to pay and may have missed their or missed the notices associated with their billing requirement. And if providers aren't paying on time, then they go into red light status, which has a multitude of implications for service providers if those payments are not in on time. So establishing that credit card payment, I think, has helped facilitate folks resolving any potential red light status or avoiding any kind of red light statuses. So that was a great addition to this. And then Welch demonstrated the flexibility when assisting the NAOWG with the R&D assumptions associated with the BNC costs. So we had significant conversations about kind of what the efforts it would take in order to administer these costs. What are all the assumptions associated with administering these costs? And a lot of the edge case issues that come up with managing the costs that they receive, pay to the vendor, and then receive back from the vendor and pay back to the service providers. So, and then Welch prepared a detailed operational review for 2019 in an easy to follow format without being given a deadline or being prompted to deliver. So we appreciated that, and I believe that was also distributed previously as well to this group. So if we want to move to the next slide, I think this might be the last slide. So with that, these are our members for the NAOWG. And I think the last slide is these are the remaining meetings. In the next slide are the remaining meetings for this year. Again, if you have any questions subsequent to the Nancy meeting, please feel free to reach out to myself or Bob or Betty. With that, I can turn it back over to Chair McKee for a vote. The two items are the contribution factor and then our rating for the BNC agent on that. So.
Thank you very much, Phil, for those presentations, and thank you to the whole NAOWG for the work on these items. I guess first I wanted to pause to see if anyone had any questions on the NAMP fund size projection or contribution factor. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions. So I will open the meeting up for a motion to approve the NAOWG report and recommendation for the billing and collection fund size projections and contribution factor. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve?
This is Bob McCausland.
Julie Oates from Peerless will make the motion.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie Oates. And do we have anyone to second the motion?
And Bob McCausland will second.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob McCausland seconds the motion. And with that, we will submit it to the council for a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Okay, do we have any nays? Okay, then Nancy approves the report and recommendations as submitted. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And then now we'll see, were there any questions on the NAOWG billing and collection agent performance evaluation? Okay, In that case, then we will vote on the performance evaluation as well. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve?
Julie Ost will make a motion to approve.
Okay, thank you again, Julie Ost approving. And anyone to second the motion?
Bob
Bridget
McCausland
Alexander
will.
White, US Connect, will second.
I'm sorry, who is that? Could you repeat your name?
Bridget Alexander White with US Connect will second.
Yes, thank you very much, Bridget, for seconding the
You're
motion.
welcome.
And with that, I'll submit this item to the council for a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, do we have any nays? All right, then Nancy approves the performance evaluation for the billing and collections agent for 2019. Next on our
Chairman.
agenda, oh, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Chair McKee, this is Phil Lindsay with Central Link, and I just wanted to just say thank you to Welch and their efforts throughout these last few years. Things have been very complicated, and to do the things that they've done basically unasked and for the benefit of the industry, I just can't say enough of how well they've worked with us, and it's just been a pleasure. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks for that, Phil, and thank you, Welch. Okay, now we will move on to an overview of the toll-free number assignment modernization working group's report and recommendations on the 833 toll-free number auction, which occurred on December 17th, 2019. Presenting for the TFAM working group are the co-chairs, Susan Gately and Julie Ost. Susan and Julie, you can go ahead with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. This is Julie Ost coming to you from Chicago. It's nice and sunny here. I hope everyone is doing well. I just want to let you know in the slides that you have before you, I broke all of my rules. I have a lot of stuff written on the slides, but since we aren't sitting in a room and you aren't trying to look at it from several feet away, I have more on here than what I will go through. I just thought having it all in one spot, or Susan and I thought having it all in one spot may be helpful in your review. So with that, we can go to the second page for a quick outline of what we're going to discuss. Basically, I have in here the auction results summary. Again, it's just an overview. I won't spend any time on that. We'll get more into the meat and potatoes of looking at our approach, the resources we used, and then what we did for our group is we broke down into two smaller groups, and one group looked at issues 2, 3, 4 because they are more closely aligned, and then another group looked at issues 1 and 5. So we didn't want to, Susan and I didn't want to have to keep ping-ponging back and forth. So I'll address issues 2, 3, and 4, and then Susan will address issues 1 and 5, and then we'll take questions. Of course, if you have questions throughout, I don't mind if you stop me. You can put up your 10 card. I'm sorry, but throw up your hand in the chat box there, and someone will let me know. So if we go to the next slide, this slide is just the auction results. It's again a summary slide, and it's just intended to refresh your memory on how many applicants there were and the bidders and the outcomes, and it's just a quick breakdown. So you can use that if you'd like to reference that when you go through the report. The next slide, if you could move to the next slide, please. The approach and resources. We discussed this a little bit last time we gave an update. The charge letter was asking for our group to look at a set of questions from the perspective of participants in the auction. So as we noted last time we met, the feedback was heavily dependent on what we could get from the folks that either participated or registered and ultimately didn't participate. So what we did with a lot of effort and help from Jordan and Mason from the FCC, and as well as the OGC, we developed what we called a feedback request, which was a very open-ended question that relied on the charge letter and said, hey, if you have feedback, please give that to us so we can take that into consideration when we developed the report. I think we did pretty good on getting feedback from a dozen or more entities. So we looked at that and incorporated that when we could. So we also, of course, looked at the auction results. Worked a lot with Joel and his team on asking him for feedback and questions, or excuse me, data that he had collected from the auction. And there were a couple of folks that were able to talk with some participants in a general nature, again, and getting their open-ended feedback on things that could improve an auction going forward. A couple folks relied on some economic literature to see what other auctions, how they're structured. The FCC also issued a notice inviting comments on the auction, so those comments were taken into consideration. And then, of course, just our internal discussions that we had when we were developing our report. We can go to the next slide, please. And then actually the one after that. So issue 2 was evaluating the education and outreach efforts that were undertaken for the auction. So in the report, you'll see there is an appendix of all the education and outreach efforts that were undertaken. I think you'll quickly realize there was a lot. I think there's no shortage of information. It was positively received, but there were just a few issues that we kind of routinely heard, in that those materials could be simplified and streamlined. And having the first crack at this, it's better to have too much out there than not enough. So streamlining that, those materials would be helpful in the future. One other small recommendation is that the FCC to maintain its auction website presence before, during, and after. And even if it's just to say, hey, the bulk of the material is at the auctioneer's website, in this case, Somos. So I'll say Somos and auctioneer kind of interchangeably. Just easier to say Somos, I gotta tell you. So that on a go-forward basis, just having that continued presence, I think, would be very helpful. And then the last point, I think, is the most helpful recommendation on a go-forward, is having a mock auction at the beginning of the process, or an on-demand video, if you will, so folks can get a sense of what the auction will look like. There were some folks that just really weren't familiar at all with this type of a process, and they were expecting more of an eBay type auction and then not a Spectrum type feeling to it. So I think just a few tweaks and this education and outreach piece can be improved. So if we want to go to the next slide, issue 3, this is where I am really crowding the page with information here, but it's tracking with our report. In this issue was evaluating the application process, in particular the requirements, and whether it ensured the Commission's goal of being simple and cost effective. So some folks thought the process was extremely challenging. It's not for the lack of effort from Somos of trying to help people through the process, but there were certainly some improvements that routinely were suggested by through the feedback. So let me explain just a little bit on the issues. One of the issues was surrounding the legal classification of an applicant. So there's different ownership levels, and that just that alone, depending on your legal classification, if you have many affiliates and I don't profess to know all of the legal ins and outs, but suffice it to say that the more complex your entity, the exponential amount of time that was spent on trying to complete the application properly. So that was a kind of a common criticism from some of those folks that had that type of business structure. Another concern that was raised more so on the other end of the spectrum, if you weren't a known entity, so you're a non-Rest Board, smaller company, you had to have your identity verified. So if there was no readily easy way to verify that you say who you say you are, you had to go through a process that was more of a video chat and show me your ID, and so there were some of those issues that we'll recommend a couple tweaks to the process on the next slide. But the last concern here on this page is after the initial submission, there was some approval uncertainty and timing concerns, especially if the application was deficient. So those are kind of the three categories where we were focusing our efforts on trying to improve the process. So if you go to the next slide, please. We have three improvements or recommendations here. So first, to help with the timing concerns and the complexities of going through the legal classifications especially, we recommend that Rest Boards and returning non-Rest Boards be approved automatically and not having to go through the application and verification process. This is, really akin to what the FCC has for other folks when they utilize an FRN or something. So we think that we could really short circuit a lot of that, and this may help improve participation as well. The second recommendation would be to allow SOMOS to provide more feedback on whether an application, when it's needing to be resubmitted for some sort of a deficiency, if the letter that initiates that deficiency, if it could go into more detail about what exactly is the issue that is deficient, and allow SOMOS to give more of a give and take on, hey, yeah, if you resubmit that, yes, it will be accepted, instead of saying, well, you have to resubmit. And then, there was definitely a time frame issue that if you resubmitted, all applications were kind of, there was a timeline, and if you didn't know if it was going to be when you resubmitted, if you didn't know for sure that was it, then you had to keep going back and forth and back and forth. So to allow more of a give and take and more of a thumbs up, yes, you have now achieved it. If you resubmitted, it will be granted. I think that's where the process needs to move towards. And the last issue was that we think the commission should consider allowing for a grace period for the non-Rest boards that went into the process with a Rest Board, but then that Rest Board didn't qualify, so they did not have an opportunity to seek someone else to move forward in the process. So those are three improvements that we think would help future auctions. If we could go to the next slide. Issue 4 talked about an upfront payment mechanism. So issue 4 really relies on trust of the bidders, and as the evaluation question states, they wanted to make sure, the commission wants to make sure that there were sincere offers. So the way we looked at this was Rest Boards shouldn't have to submit some sort of an upfront payment because they've already proven they're trusted entities by the nature of them being responsible organizations, and they have current toll-free inventory that can be used as collateral or a fine levied on them. They are a known entity and should just be allowed to participate. As far as an upfront payment mechanism for the non-REST boards, our recommendation was more of a bond requirement or creating an upfront payment percentage tied to an auction cost that could cover the minimum cost of setting up for the auction. And the final recommendation on this point would be that the working group suggests that additional payment methods be utilized to help encourage participation. It was just a suggestion. I don't think it was a gating factor for participation, but it was a suggestion that may increase participation. So I totally went through that really fast on my 3 issues. I'd be happy to take questions now on any of those issues, or if Susan wants to wait until the end, I'm easy either way.
People can ask questions now if they'd like.
I put everyone to sleep, Susan. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi, Susan Gately here. The subgroup that I worked with dealt with issues 1 and 5 out of the charge letter that we got, and they went primarily to, you can move on to the next slide, to the auction mechanism itself and the process, as opposed to sort of the details of how it worked, the education and et cetera that Julie was just talking to you about. To get started in evaluating the questions in front of us, we spent a lot of time at first talking about what some of the terms that were used in those questions meant and defined some of those up front. So we defined participants to be broader than just bidders in the auction. We decided that participants really needed to be anybody that evaluated registering for the auction, even if they came, up against something that kept them from completing that process, or they decided not to participate. Anybody that actually registered for the auction, even if they did not make a bid in the end. Of course, bidders, which is not on this list. And finally, the customers that those parties the REST boards that participated in the auction were trying to obtain numbers for, because there are some issues related to customers that wanted numbers that came up as a part of this auction. So it was a broad definition of participants. For potential future auction participants, we really did not know how to band that, because it could be any party that may want a number in the future, because it is unclear how broadly the Commission may extend this market-based approach. So we read very broadly in considering the issues that we had. One of our questions specifically asked about utility, and we determined that utility in this instance needed to be read to mean both useful and also fit for a purpose, and that we needed to look at that from the perspective of both winners of numbers and losers in the auction. If you move to the next slide, we also needed to define equitable and efficient, because those were terms that were included in the questions that were given to us. For equitable, that was defined to mean fairness in our evaluation, that there be a consistent set of rules known by everybody, applied equally to everybody, with everybody having the same chance to bid on a number and subject to the same conditions. And the term efficient, which really could be defined in many different ways, was read in terms of the functioning of the market. Was it efficient related to the transaction cost to all the participants, to the administrator, and to the proceeds from the auction? And we determined that it needed to be measured in terms of not only of dollars, but in also of other kinds of resources that were committed, including time spent on the process before and after the auction. Was that process efficient? And including any changes in the value of the items that may have occurred over time because of the delay in releasing the items to the winners. So those were the terms that we defined in getting started. And if you move down to the next slide now, we also felt it necessary to sort of just determine where our questions went to. How did this auction work, and what might want to be changed about it going forward? What could you do differently? So we wanted to define the major characteristics of the auction were that it was a single round, wasn't a multi-round bid. You couldn't see that somebody outbid you and raise your bid, single round. Sealed bid, nobody knew what any of the other bidder amounts were. And it was a victory auction. And if you are not familiar with that, that's a second price auction structure. The highest bidder wins, but they pay the price bid by the second place bidder. I won't go into why that is considered, an efficient structure in some cases, but that was what was done. So instead of paying so if the higher, somebody needs to get back on mute, I think. Can somebody please put themselves on mute? No. Okay. I'm going to try to talk through that. If you folks can't hear, can somebody signal to me and I'll stop and wait? So in a victory auction, if the highest bidder bids $100 and the lowest bidder and the second bidder bids $2, the person who bid the $100 price wins, but they only pay $2. So those were the primary characteristics of the auction as it was held. Move on to the next slide. Okay, so the first question that came to us was that, to evaluate the utility for bidders of the auction structure of the Vickery single round sealed bid auction, and to identify more useful alternative designs or changes to it. So the first thing was to evaluate the utility to the auction participants. And if we're looking at utility as to mean useful, clearly it was useful to the winners. In many cases, the winners bid, $100,000 and got a number for nothing or for $10. So it was very useful to the winners. It was not useful to those that didn't win or that were unable to participate because of some of the complexities that Julie was talking about earlier. So that was what we got from reviewing and talking to people. In terms of fit for purpose, we don't think that the auction that was used or our evaluation shows that it probably was not fit for the purpose. The numbers that were available for assignment were held in abeyance for 2.5 years after 833 was opened. Fewer than 2% of the numbers that were set aside received more than one bid. We don't know why that is, whether it was that the original set aside was too broad. Each REST board was asked to identify 2,000 numbers that it might want, so it wasn't really a list of, what numbers do I really need or would I be willing to pay for. It was a very broad list. We don't know if that's why only 2% of the numbers received more than a single bid. We don't know if it's the fact that 2.5 years lapsed from when 833 was open and the auction happened, or because of the complexity. But we do know that, very small quantity of the numbers received multiple bids. So that suggests that something is wrong with the utility of the process. Next slide. We also recognize that for 1,400 of the numbers, you can see this table up here, there were 17,000 numbers available in the auction. 1,660 received bids, but only 254 received more than one bid. So 1,400 of the numbers only received a single bid. And the bidders for those numbers had to go through the time and expense of participating in the auction to get a number that had no other bids. So ultimately, they weren't able to gain the use of the number for a very long time, a much longer time than if the auction hadn't happened. They got the number for free. So there was not much utility in that auction for those folks. And there are some numbers that still aren't available to parties that requested them because the party was not, these are end user customers that weren't able to get numbers because the RESBORG that they had chosen to use in the auction was not able to participate at the end of the day. So our evaluation of utility in terms of fit for purpose came back with a no, not particularly. Next slide, please. So the issue 5 question was to recommend improvements for future auctions, changes to the mechanism that might make this work better in the future. So the problems that we identified flowing out of the Vickery model were that it's equitable. It's an equitable process in terms of fair, as we defined it early on. But there were perverse results that came out of it. The initial trial failed to yield a market-based price for most of the numbers, and this was specifically true where the winner was the only bidder and paid nothing. So if you think back to the chart I showed you on the previous page, there were 1,660 numbers that got a bid. 1,400 of them only had a single bidder. And the way that the auction was structured, if I bid $500,000 for a number and nobody else bid on it, I would win the number and I would pay nothing. It's our view, based on the research that we did, that interpreting the second price to be zero in a single bid situation would be a misinterpretation of the Vickery second price model. There isn't a second price to use as a market-based price if there's only one bid. So assuming a zero price is inconsistent with the goal of that auction structure. It's also inconsistent with coming up with a market solution, which is what the Commission was aiming for, to be able to get market-based prices and a market distribution of these numbers. So it is our recommendation that single bidder instances should instead have been declared as no transaction under the Vickery auction style used in the December trial. It should have been treated, pulled outside of the auction. Okay, next slide. We also saw when we analyzed the data that there were, in many cases, a just tremendous gap between the first and the second price bids. It's likely due to the fact that the Vickery auction encourages bidders to hit very high figures because the only goal is having the highest number bid. You're not going to pay that highest bid. Every auction has its own incentive characteristics, but one of the characteristics of this Vickery auction, with no other parameters around it, no floor price, no relationship between the first and second bids. One of the outcomes is that you're going to get extreme bids. You're going to have extreme bids in both directions. Until very recently, Vickery auctions were almost entirely theoretical. They were first posited in the mid 50s, and they've been around since then, but they've been almost entirely theoretical discussion points by economists, not used a lot. They are used at the present time by a lot of online platforms for selling ad time and ad space to individual consumers, but that's a very different model and process than what we were doing here. So those were the problems that we saw with the model itself. Now on to the actual recommendations on the next slide. So we recommended that if the Commission is going to go forward with future auctions, that it use a more traditional first price, single round sealed bid auction. The feedback that we got from folks was that they did not have any problem with the auction, with the first, or we did not get any feedback about problems with the single round or the sealed bid components of the auction. Using a first price model would be, no more or less equitable in terms of in comparison to the Vickery auction, because you would still have, stable rules applied equally to everybody, but it would bring in substantially more revenue, and that revenue could be used to support both the auction itself and the overall costs associated with running the toll-free number assignment process. So if you're going to have an auction and sell numbers, generally you would want to have more revenue coming out of that. We also recommend that there be principles adopted to avoid zero price or unreasonably low assignments. So if the commission continues with a Vickery auction, or even if it's a first price auction, there should be some sort of a minimum price or standard floor. There has to be something that recognizes the fact that there are costs associated with doing this, and that whoever walks away with that number has it on a different basis than the rest of folks that are assigned numbers through the normal process. They, in fact, own that number and are able to buy and sell it going forward. So there should be some sort of a minimum price. We posited $1,000 per number in the report. And we also, if the Vickery auction continues to be used, there should be a floor and something that recognizes the big variation between the highest bid and the second bid. So whether that be, setting the purchase price at a midpoint or some other manner, there needs to be something to keep these numbers from being sold at unreasonably low levels. And we also recommended that numbers with a single bid be returned back to the normal pool of numbers to be made available immediately to whoever that single bidder was, not to be sort of held in abeyance forever or for another auction, but to be made available to immediately to the single bidder under traditional number assignment rules. So no ownership transfer. They get the number just, as they would have if the auction hadn't happened. So those are the mechanism changes. We also did recommend some process changes. There's not a slide in here for those. They're very similar to the process changes that Julie has already gone through, making RESPORCs be automatically included in the, as viable bidders, et cetera. So there were some minor process changes recommended there, but these are the big recommendations. Questions? Next slide.
Susan, this is Marilyn. The Nancy Vice Chair, Commissioner Williamson, has his hands raised.
Hello.
Hello, I just had to remember to turn off mute. Yes, I appreciate the work that your group has done, and I do appreciate this presentation. I'm an economist, so you've got my ears perked up about the inefficiency in this auction, or the apparent inefficiency, and in particular, I would be concerned that if it can't cover the cost of the auction, it's got some things that could be improved. One question I have is, in the mind of the customer, the ultimate consumer of the number, there is a potential different value between receiving one number versus another. In other words, they have a reason or a utility for wanting a particular number. Was there, and I think that knowledge, if the TFAM group could figure out what's going on, I think that knowledge would help you set floor prices for specific numbers that you know to have more value to the bidders than other numbers. Because if you act on the assumption that all of them have some minimal, they're all equal in terms of their value to bidders, I think you're missing some of the information that the market may know and you may not. Did you work on that at all?
So we did not. So there were many things that we would have liked to work on, but our charge was fairly narrow. That is not something that we worked on, but it is one of the problems that is, that arises from this entire process, and that the auction itself was designed to sort of find out. There is really not a way to know what the value of these numbers are. They've never been legally available for sale before. So this is the first shot at that. And what we got out of it was, there would be, I think there was only one of the numbers that had, and Joel would know the answers, would have these numbers on the tip of his finger. There was, one, maybe two numbers that had 10 bidders. There were, just a handful of numbers that had more than 4 bidders. And as I said, only 250 numbers altogether that had at least 2 bidders. So most of them did not have high bids on them, and some of them there were literally $1 million. There was the first price bid was $1 million. The second price bid was 11 or 3. So we still don't have a sense of what the value is there.
If I may add something.
May I? This is Julie Ost with Peerless, and I just want to add to what Susan is saying that there, in part of our evaluation, specifically on question 4, our original draft actually looked to include a piece on looking more at value, but value is such a nebulous term when it comes to toll-free. We felt in the end that it really wasn't part of the charge, but it is certainly, to the point of your question, it's an interesting piece of this puzzle on how to come up with a reasonable either it be in some kind of an upfront cost or some piece of this that looks to value, but what's value to a business is not valuable to another business. So I don't know if that I don't think that really moved the ball forward at all, but we did look at it, but then ultimately we felt as if it kind of ran afoul of what the charge letter said. But I'll defer to Ola, who I think is wanting to chime in at this point.
Yeah. This is Ola Yufusi. I'm also an economist. We looked at the valuation issue, and we knew that based on our research that each participant we have their independent valuation. However, the fact that we are dealing with a sealed bid situation, that valuation is known only to the participant or to the person that is bidding. So it is not the type of auction structure where you do an open bid, everybody knows what you bid, and then you go to another round and you bid again. That is where valuation or subsequent valuation can be put into consideration, and then we can do something with it. But in this kind of structure, we could not do, even the auctioneer by getting the secret bid cannot do anything with that valuation information from the different participants, because it's a single time bid, and there's already some rules set at the beginning where it says that the highest bid wins, and the second highest bid is the price. So if we to consider what you're suggesting, then we have to now think about a different type of auction, and that has to be set at the beginning. Everybody has to know those rules. So the sealed bid kind of cut out the possibility of being able to consider any information about valuation, even if we knew it.
But isn't it? But it is true that a first price auction would at least yield. So if another auction is done and they use a first price auction as opposed to the Vickery model, then people will be bidding what the value is to them, or certainly not above what the value is to them, because they are going to have to pay what they bid. They might underbid because they don't.
That is correct.
They won't overbid. So
that is correct.
This is Marilyn. I got a chat from Joel. He's unable to participate by the audio. He's having technical difficulties, but he did chat with me that only one number had 10 bidders, and that number was 833-333-3333.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is not surprising that would be the most highly valued of the numbers. it may be that there's not that much of a market for these numbers, that there are a very limited number of them that have value, but we don't know whether it was mechanism problems, time delay, or something else that caused the low response. We might know more if it's done again. So that is our report. Any other questions? If you go ahead 2 slides, I just want to go before we finish, thank our working group and Jordan Mason and the OGC staff for all of their help, because we required a fair amount of guidance getting ourselves going on this process and figuring out how to reach out to the public and talk to them. And then the next slide shows the members of the working group. People participated at various levels and at various times. Some folks were not able to participate once the pandemic hit and their responsibilities changed substantially. So not all of the names on the list were active writers of the report, but this is our group. And thank you to all of them.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, Julie, for that presentation. And if we're done with our discussion of the topic, I'll open it up for a motion to approve the toll-free number assignment modernization working group report and recommendations for the 833 toll-free auction analysis. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve?
This is Karen Charles Peterson. So moved.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate that. And would anyone like to second the motion?
Barry Hobbins, second.
Thank you very much, Barry. With that second, we'll submit the item to the council for a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, do we have any nays? Great, then Nancy approves the report and recommendations as submitted. Thank you, everyone, and a special thanks to the TFAM working group members and the leadership for all of your extensive work on this item. Now we will move on to public participation. And as I discussed earlier, since we're doing these meetings virtually, we enable public participation through comments filed in the docket and also through the dedicated email address livequestions@fcc.gov. So first, we'll turn to see if any comments were filed in the docket in response to the public notice for this meeting, which was released on May 27th, and asked members of the public to submit any comments to the ECFS filing system in docket 92-237. Do we get any comments from members of the public through ECFS?
No, there have not been any comments.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any public comments or questions received through the live questions email address?
Yes, there were several questions submitted regarding a toll-free numbering administrator. So how about I kind of read out the group, and then you and Marilyn can decide how many you want me to repeat?
Okay.
So there's 5 questions. The first is, when do you expect to determine whether you'll appoint a new toll-free numbering administrator? How much is the contract worth? What role will public comment play in your decision? Who makes the ultimate determination? And how are companies eligible for consideration?
Madam Chair, this is Karen Charles Peterson. I have a question. Was the 5 questions that were just read, was that from one commenter? Or 5? It feels like it was from one, but I just want to confirm that.
Yes, that's correct. Those all came from one commenter.
Thank you.
CJ, this is Pam Arlick. It sounds like those questions are related to an iConnective petition that was filed and put out for public comment. So I don't really think it's appropriate for really discussion here in this forum.
This is Julie Oaks. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, Marilyn, I don't know how this normally works, but I mean, that's a we just put it out for public comment. I don't think we could really answer any of those questions right now anyway.
So Pam, this is Marilyn. So those questions came from Com Daly, so we could take them back to the division and coordinate a response with the media relation code.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Pam, and everyone.
Okay, sounds good. Were those the only questions that came in through the email address?
That's correct, yes.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you very much. And then the last item on the agenda, other business. Do we have any members that have any other business that they wish to address at this time?
Yes, Madam Chair, this is Bob McCausland.
Okay, Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. Today's Daily Digest includes a release from Chairman Pai on the use of 988 as the National Suicide Prevention and Mental Health hotline number. And I wanted to highlight that many members of our current NAOWG and certainly some former members contributed greatly to the recommendations to the Commission on the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline. So I wanted to highlight, for those of you who haven't seen the release from the chairman, it's public and I'm sure it's posted openly on the FCC's website. And I think for those of us who spent a considerable amount of time working and putting a lot of great care into the recommendations that we, the NAOWG, had submitted to the Commission, we would want to read through a lot of those comments and appreciate a lot of what's being said, and also appreciate the good work of the Commission following our recommendations on many of the issues that were included in there. So I thought that was worth highlighting, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Bob. Does anyone have anything else they want to raise? Okay, hearing nothing, then I will just remind everyone that our next NANCY meeting will also be a virtual meeting similar to this one, and it will take place in 2 weeks on Tuesday, July 28th, beginning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now, Bruce, as the Vice Chair, is there anything you would like to add at this time?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Marilyn, anything else from the Commission?
No, nothing else from the Commission.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marilyn. If there's nothing else, I would like to thank everyone for your time this afternoon. Please stay safe. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.